Good afternoon. I'm Bill Anderson, and I will tell you that the secular humanist group, we meet every Sunday morning, and we bring in usually by video, a variety of speakers on various subjects about ethics and morals and philosophy and so on, viewed from the particular secular humanist perspective. And it occurs to us now and then that we've got some people in the building here who are experts in some of those things. So we went out and got Roy, and Roy is as you know, he and Elizabeth have been here since 2013 about, and he is, let me get the titles right, he is the Weyerhaeuser Professor of Biblical Literature and Professor of Religion at Whitman College, and he has BA from Pasadena, his doctorate's from Harvard. In the 1980s, he gathered together with a large group of other scholars to sort of examine the question of what the real evidence, historical evidence, showed about the life of Jesus. And this group of scholars published a series of books and articles. Roy's articles have been published in the Harvard Theological Review. He's written 4 or 5 books, one of them published just this year. So he's still very much involved in this, and we're delighted that we could bring him here to talk to you today. We'll have about maybe 45 minutes from Roy, and then there'll be Q&A. And Roy's asked if you hold your questions until the end, that he'll be able to respond to them more completely. Okay? Any questions about that? Roy Hoover.
Right up a little bit for me. I can see it okay, but let's go. I don't want to get lost in my own text here. Thank you all for coming. We have come to Anderson Hall this afternoon because we have at least some interest in what we can know about Jesus as a figure of history. It may not have occurred to most of us that in the long history of the Western world, our interest in the historical Jesus looks rather unusual. The fact of the matter is that interest in Jesus of Nazareth as a figure of history receded from the mind of the early church or anyone else in the Roman world not long after his death, and remained lost to view for most of the next 1800 years. That is to say, no pope, no bishop, no scholar made the Jesus of history a subject of inquiry during the whole of that long period. But in the 19th century, the historical Jesus reappeared as a person of interest and attracted so much scholarly attention that by 1906, when Albert Schweitzer published his classic study, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, he was convinced that critical scholarship on the historical Jesus, quote, had laid down the conditions and determined the course of the religious thinking of the future. Quite a change. This afternoon, I'm going to deal with 3 questions that arise out of this momentous change in historical and religious interest. And for each of these 3 questions, I will offer, to begin with, a one-word answer, a verbal nail on which to hang some data and comments. Could we have the first slide up here on the screen, please? Are we up? Okay. The first question, why was there no interest in the historical Jesus until comparatively recently? The answer in one word is Nicaea. Second question, why is it that the historical Jesus came to be interesting to Schweitzer and presumably to some degree to us? The answer in one word is Galileo. Third question, what evidence is there for the historical Jesus and how do we find it? The answer in one word is excavation. Now, if you can remember these 3 words, Nicaea, Galileo, excavation, you'll probably remember about as much of this lecture tomorrow morning as you care to. I will give only brief attention to the first 2 questions and spend most of my time with the third. So then, to the first question, why was there no interest in the Jesus of history until comparatively recently? And what does Nicaea have to do with it? Nicaea was a city near the northwest coast of modern-day Turkey, where the first Ecumenical Council of the Christian Church convened on the first day of June in 325 of the Common Era. This was an unprecedented gathering in which all of the bishops of the whole Roman world were invited, although most of those who actually came were from the eastern half of the empire, about 300 of them altogether. The bishops had originally planned to meet in Ankara, but the new Roman emperor, Constantine, proposed that the location of the council be changed to Nicaea, and so the council convened in Nicaea. In appreciation for the bishops' cooperation, the emperor agreed to pay their travel expenses and their hospitality for as long as the council was in session. There was a theological issue that occasioned this gathering of the bishops, namely the question of whether Jesus was a model human being or a divine being. At Nicaea, the majority of the bishops voted for the claim that Jesus was a divine being, not just a human being. And so ever since that time, it has been more important to know about the divine Jesus than about the Jesus of history. And that is why the answer to our first question, why was there no interest in the Jesus of history until comparatively recently, is Nicaea. At Nicaea, church and state joined in pronouncing the divine Jesus the real Jesus. Second question, if the Council of Nicaea resulted in making the divine Christ more important than the historical Jesus, why have we become interested in Jesus as a historical figure at this late date? And what does Galileo have to do with it? Beginning in 1609, by using a new invention, a telescope, Galileo was able to demonstrate that Copernicus' new and controversial theory that the Earth and planets revolved around the sun and not vice versa was observably true. What seems so ordinary and even commonplace for us was a world-destroying and world-creating discovery then. Everything that the church and everyone else thought they knew about the world and human life in it reflected the assumption that the Earth was at the center of the universe, that the sun, moon, planets, and stars revolved around the Earth. The shock and disorientation, especially among leading churchmen, was devastating. Everything they had believed seemed to be undermined, and their authority as representatives of the heavenly Christ on earth was threatened. The telescope, therefore, had to be an unproven and unreliable instrument. Furthermore, what Galileo claimed was contrary to Scripture and therefore had to be an impious error. The theologians and churchmen were not alone in their rejection of Galileo's discovery. The philosophers in the universities noted that what Galileo was claiming was contrary to Aristotle and therefore could not be regarded as credible. In his famous letter to the Grand Duchess Christina in defense of his view, Galileo tried to make the point that there need be no contradiction between God's two great books, the book of nature and the book of Scripture, if we know how to read them. The Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, Galileo argued, not how the heavens go. But the two parts of that clever one-liner are more closely related than Galileo at the time was prepared to admit. If the Bible is wrong about how the heavens go, maybe it's not exactly right about how to go to heaven either. Or even whether it's right to suppose that humans are destined for heaven at all. The ripple effect of Galileo's discovery effectively undermined the traditional theology that had been held to define the Church's faith for more than 1,000 years. When Galileo's discovery showed that the Church's assumption that the earth was at the center of the universe was mistaken, the Nicene Creed, which had assumed that that mistaken view corresponded with reality, lost its credibility also. In the empty space that resulted from the fall of that piece of theological statuary, the figure of Jesus, the Jesus of history, reappeared as a person of interest. Our view of the heavens changed after Galileo, but the realities of life on earth we came to see remained much the same. If the Nicene Creed did not belong to what we now regard as the real world, the Jesus of history did. And that is why Galileo is the one-word answer to the second question: why is it that the historical Jesus became interesting to Schweitzer and to us? Third question: what evidence is there for the historical Jesus, and how do we find it? Most of the evidence we have for the historical Jesus is found in 5 early Christian Gospels, the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, plus the Gospel of Thomas. So the evidence about Jesus as a figure of history is mostly embedded in texts written in Greek in the first century of the Common Era. In order to identify this evidence, we have to excavate these texts. By excavation, I mean digging into the levels of information that are to be found in those texts. I'm not talking about visiting an archaeological site and finding stones or pottery or something like that that will give us evidence for the historical Jesus. We're excavating texts. Most of the evidence we have, let's see, I've done that. We can begin our excavation by asking where these texts came from. Who were the authors of these texts? The traditional answer is that they were either apostles, Matthew, John, Thomas, or associates of apostles. The author of the Gospel of Mark, presumably an associate of Peter, and Luke, supposedly an associate of Paul. But here's the first surprise for anyone who is excavating these texts for the first time. Actually, these Gospels are all anonymous. None of the authors of the New Testament Gospels tells us his name in his text. So if none of the Gospels was written by one of the apostles, a number of questions have to be answered. First, where did the Gospel authors get their information? What did they do? What did they do with it? How exactly did they use the information available to them in creating their own versions of the story of Jesus? How can we figure this out? Scholars began to work on the question of where the Gospel authors got their information in the first half of the 19th century. So this has been going on for quite some time. By closely examining, by closely comparing the texts of the synoptic Gospels. So-called synoptic because they reflect the same basic view of the question of the story of Jesus and its sources. They were interested in answering two questions in particular. First, how can we explain both the large amount of material found in all 3 of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that is either the same or very similar? And second, how can we account for the material that is found in 1 or 2 of them but not in the others? In short, how can we explain the close similarities and the significant differences in these 3 Gospels? St. Augustine may have been the first to have attempted to solve this problem a long time ago. He proposed that the Gospel of Mark is probably an abbreviated version of Matthew. Matthew, I would remind you, is 28 chapters long. The Gospel of Mark is only 16 chapters long, so quite an abbreviation. Producing something that would be something like what we might call a Reader's Digest version of the Gospel. If that is indeed what happened, if Augustine is right, then one has to ask what have persuaded Mark to leave out the story of Jesus' birth that he found in Matthew. Why would Mark have omitted Matthew's stories of the risen Jesus from his gospel, present in Matthew, not in Mark. And why would Mark delete or omit the Sermon on the Mount? Probably the finest cluster of teachings of Jesus in any of the Gospels. At least some would argue so. Furthermore, if Luke also used Matthew as a source, why did Luke tell a completely different story about Jesus' birth? Those are two different stories in Matthew and in Luke. But he scattered, why would he have omitted the Sermon on the Mount entirely? He would have scattered much of the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount throughout his gospel. It seems clear that Augustine's attempt to solve what we have come to call the synoptic problem itself has some serious problems. It's hard to regard it as a persuasive theory. As you can see, I'm finding this stool thing a little bit awkward. I'm going to try standing up and see if I can make do with it a little better here. So, to make a long story short, scholars have become convinced that the best solution to the synoptic problem is what has been called the four-source theory. Could we have the second slide, please? The second slide shows that Mark is, everybody agrees, the earliest narrative gospel written. That is, it tells the story of Jesus' life and not just what he taught. Secondly, Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a written source. More about that in a bit. Matthew and Luke also used another written source which scholars have abbreviated by the simple letter Q. It's the first letter of the German word Quelle, which means source. And unlike the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Q does not tell the story of Jesus' life. It simply is a compilation of sayings, some 112 of them. And fourth, Matthew used some material found only in his gospel. Scholars refer to that as special M and special Matthew, and Luke did the same, special Luke. Those are the four sources that have been identified by scholarship in the synoptic gospels. So the result of this first step in excavating the gospels is that we are now able to see a substantial part of the answer to the question of where Matthew and Luke got their information. Most of it from previously written sources, especially from Mark and from Q. But one can also say more about what results from this first level of excavation and how it changes our mind about how we think about the Gospels and what kinds of writings they are. Namely, as we've said, none of the synoptic Gospels was written by one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. The church added the titles to the Gospels as we know them. And when it became important to the churches to claim that their version of the Gospel was the authentic version, it went back to the apostolic period. That's why the titles of the synoptic Gospels came to be attached to those texts. Now, this is not just a matter of scholarly speculation. I want to read to you the preface to the Gospel of Luke, in which the author of that Gospel tells us something that confirms much of what I've just been describing. In the first 4 verses of the Gospel of Luke, it reads as follows: "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things that have been, about which you have been informed." Here the author of Luke is telling us that he's not an eyewitness. He's following information that began with eyewitnesses, and he is assuming that he has enough information to write an orderly account, his own version of the story. That's from the Gospel of Luke, so that's kind of consistent with what we have said that modern scholars have, at least in part, concluded about the origin of the Gospels. So we've looked at the question of sources. What sources did the Gospel authors, especially the synoptic Gospel authors, use to write their stuff? There's another level of excavation that makes it clear that the Gospels are all interpretive versions of the story of Jesus. Each Gospel author is concerned with what he thinks that story should mean to his readers. Scholars refer to this as redaction criticism. A less fancy word for many of us is just editing. How did the Gospel authors edit their stories? How can we identify the means they used to edit them? One of the ways to do that is kind of interesting, is to look at how each of the 4 New Testament Gospels, the authors of them, chose the first speech, the first time that Jesus comes to speech in his Gospel. This is a conscious decision on the part of the Gospel author, because he wants that speech to represent what is most important to understanding what the story of Jesus is about. So let me just give you quickly how these 4 Gospel authors bring Jesus to speech for the first time, his inaugural address, if I might say. The Gospel of Mark, the 4th chapter of Mark, the first time Jesus comes to speech, is made up entirely of parables. The Gospel of Matthew is, of course, made up by the Sermon on the Mount, not a chapter of parables. The Gospel of Luke is made up of the story of how Jesus returns to his hometown, Nazareth, and what kind of reception he received there. And the Gospel of John, there's a pious Jewish man named Nicodemus who is told he must be born again. He must have a personal religious experience. 4 inaugural addresses, if you will, in Gospels. They're all different. They all reflect the judgment of the author about what is important, what is most important in his Gospel text. So this level of excavation makes it clear that it's a mistake to assume that the Gospels are intended to be objective reports, and that what they are most concerned about is factual accuracy. The authors of these Gospels are not investigative journalists. They are evangelists. They are all primarily concerned with persuading their readers about what the story of Jesus means, not about the factual accuracy as we understand it. That standard of accuracy is the standard of the age of science and historical reason. It's the standard of the modern world, not the standard of the ancient world. So we have so far dealt with 2 levels, 2 answers to the question of where the Gospel authors get their information and what they do with it. There's a 3rd one I want to mention here. Across the 40-year period between the crucifixion of Jesus and the creation of Mark's Gospel, the memory of what Jesus said and did was transmitted orally. We have 4 decades in which there are no written sources. There is memory and the oral transmission of memory. That's quite a long time. There are several things one can observe about oral transmission. One can say, for example, Jesus, like Socrates, wrote nothing. He was an oral teacher. In an oral culture, secondly, the only teaching that is preserved is what is remembered, of course, and the teaching that is most easily remembered is speech that has a pattern. 2 patterned forms of speech show up in the Gospels as especially characteristic, the Synoptic Gospels especially characteristic of the teaching of Jesus. 2 forms of oral transmission. 1, short stories that we call parables, and aphorisms, which we call one-liners. There are some 133 parables in the Synoptic Gospels, and there are 33 parables and 133 versions of aphorisms in the Gospel. So we have both parables and aphorisms are present in the remembered teaching of Jesus in large numbers. And furthermore, there is no other early Christian writer in which parables and aphorisms are present in anything like this amount. So it's an indication that we have here evidence of a single historical individual, a person whose habit of speech is registered in a way that has nothing comparable in early Christian literature. Yeah, and no other figure in antiquity made use of parables in the way as extensively as Jesus did according to the Gospels. Yes, there are parables in rabbinic literature in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. Well, what's interesting about these rabbinic parables is that they are always used to illustrate Scripture. Jesus never tells a parable to illustrate Scripture. It may come as a surprise to some of us to hear one say that Jesus is not a scriptural teacher. He does not appeal to Scripture to authorize it or to back up his teaching. In telling his parables, Jesus appeals to the intelligence and imagination of his hearers and expects that they will get the point. In this respect, Jesus' parables work like jokes. If you tell a good joke in the right way, everybody gets it. If you have to explain the joke, you are either a poor joke teller or you have hold of a very poor joke. Yeah. Jesus' use of parables, my point here is distinctive. That's the major point here. His use of parables themselves, a typical form of oral transmission because it's easily remembered and it's according to a pattern. And nobody from the ancient world tells parables in the same way that Jesus did or was as valuable in his use of parables as they are. I want to switch to the second pattern form of speech, aphorisms or one-liners, as we sometimes refer to them. The point I want to make here is that everybody knows a proverb, whether they are widely known one-liners, proverbs, and everyone knows proverbs, but no one knows who first said them. The Jesus Seminar regards the aphorisms as in the Gospels as evidence of the voice of Jesus because aphorisms always have the name of an individual attached to them. People not only know the aphorism, the one-liner, they know who first said it. Now, what I want to do here is try an audience participation test. I've just made a claim about proverbs being widely known, shall we say universally known, but nobody knows who first said them. And I've said that aphorisms are, again, well-known one-liners, but everybody knows who first said them. So the real contrast between proverbs and aphorisms. I want to try that thesis out here on you. I want you to be free to participate. I'm going to quote some proverbs and then some aphorisms, and I want you to tell me who first said them. Let's start with proverbs. Let's see if you can identify who first said. Buy low, sell high. It never rains but it pours. The early bird catches the worm. A stitch in time saves 9. Give a man enough rope and he'll hang himself. Easy come, easy go. God helps those who help themselves. Some of the members of the seminar wish that Jesus had said that. Now let's try Proverbs. I didn't get anybody suggesting who first said any of those one-liners. Let's try this on aphorisms. All's well that ends well. Shakespeare. A house divided cannot stand. Lincoln. It ain't over till it's over. Yogi Berra. It's deja vu all over again. Yogi Berra once again. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. JFK. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. FDR. I don't mind dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens. Woody Allen. So here we are. We've had an audience participation test. Aphorisms always are tied to an individual. That's true of the aphorisms of Jesus also. We can regard those aphorisms as evidence for a particular historical period. That's what we're interested in. What is the evidence for Jesus as a historical figure? And aphorisms as well as parables are part of that literary evidence. So there is something to this. The parables and aphorisms of the historical Jesus are traceable to a distinctive voice. This third level of excavation, we've looked at sources, the written sources being primarily Mark and Q that we have identified, and editing, the means that gospel authors resorted to in editing the story to fit the way they thought the story meant. And now we have the third one of identifying in oral transmission forms of speech that are tied to an individual person. So Jesus' parables and aphorisms tell us something specific about what this figure was about. So, in these authentic parables and aphorisms, we have historical evidence that testifies to the existence of a specific individual who had things to say that some of his followers found memorable and significant enough to put in writing after his shocking crucifixion and used to create a narrative about his life and its meaning that his followers called a gospel. Now the question is, can we discern in these parables and aphorisms a unifying theme that held them together and implied a coherent point of view that characterized his teaching as a whole and guided his course of action? If such an ordering vision or characteristic and coherent point of view is discernible, could it suggest an answer to the question of what the historical Jesus' aim was, what he was trying to do? In other words, could one find in these authentic speech fragments themselves a feature or features that might enable one to assemble a mosaic that would resemble a profile of their author? Can they work as evidence that would, upon examination, enable one to draw a profile of this historical figure? I began my own attempt to find an answer to these questions by a close reading of the sayings identified by the Jesus Seminar as authentic words of Jesus shortly after their publication in 1993 as the Five Gospels. I just brought along a copy of it to show that we do have, published by Macmillan in 1993, co-authored by Robert Walter Funk, the founder of the Jesus Seminar, and some guy from Walla Walla named Roy Hoover. As I read the compilation of authentic sayings, I began to notice a repeated summons to what I call single-mindedness in them. A repeated summons to an unconditional trust in and commitment to the reign of God. I suggest that this ordering vision is most clearly expressed in two clusters of authentic sayings in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, and which later readers call the Sermon on the Mount, and that everything else that Jesus said and did is consistent with what is expressed in these words in the 5th chapter of Matthew. I'm going to give you a little sample of what some of that language is, so it's not just a matter of a claim hanging out there in the air. Some of you will find these words familiar and characteristic of the gospel that this young man from Nazareth preached. This is from Matthew 5:38 to 48. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation of this, so I'm going to depending on the acuteness of your hearing. You have heard that it was said that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other. And if anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to him who begs from you, and do not refuse him who would borrow from you. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun to shine on the evil and the good, sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? They even had an IRS back then, apparently. And if you salute only your brethren, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Here's the biggest punchline in this whole passage. You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. You must be just as good as God is. That's quite a statement, isn't it? Anyway, that sample from the Sermon on the Mount is what I'm referring to when I say that cluster represents the content, the substance of Jesus' teaching in a way in which everything else he has to say, all the other parables, aphorisms, and his activity are consistent with that claim of total commitment, give your life, bet your life on this material, and make your ideal not are you doing what everybody else does and getting away with it, but your behavior is to be judged by the measure of whether or not it measures up to God's own perfection. I should say that the word perfect there in Greek and in English implies that which cannot be improved upon. That's not quite what it says in the original Hebrew or in Greek for that matter. It means to be whole, complete, totally consistent. There are no exceptions to this recommendation. You're not to be choosy about how you behave. You always know what the standard of behavior is. Now there's one more test. I think I'm going to be able to finish here pretty close to giving you 15 minutes for Q&A. It sharpens our perception of Jesus' ordering vision, what I call his ordering vision, further. If we compare his view with that of the 3 principal forms of Judaism of his time. These were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, according to Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century. These groups all advocated what they regarded as how Judaism should be understood and practiced in their time. I'm going to give you just a 1-paragraph example of what distinguished each of these groups. They're all forms of Judaism, but they have different emphases and different ideas about how one should go about being, shall we say, a model member of the Jewish community. The Pharisees had their origin in the 2nd century before the Common Era, with a group of Jews who were determined to resist the secularizing influence of Greek culture. You know that after Alexander the Great, Hellenistic culture, Greek culture spread pretty much around the Mediterranean world. Cities were founded, literature was translated into Greek. In fact, in Alexandria, Egypt, a translation of the Hebrew Bible was made from Hebrew into Greek because Greek was the primary language of Jewish people in Alexandria at the time. So pervasive was the effective influence of Greek culture by the time we get to Jesus' time. And here are a group of Jews who became Pharisees who did not want Judaism to be sort of, what shall we say, shunted to second place in the culture, and wanted the Jewish way of life to be their primary way of life, and they wanted everybody to see what that meant. What they did was to elevate certain elements of Jewish practice, Jewish observance of their religion to new heights. The most distinctive way they did this was by extending the purity rules for priests for consuming food when they were serving in the temple. There's a special order, a special rule about the kind of food you were permitted to eat as a Jewish priest serving in the most sacred place in their land. That rule, probably known by us mostly as kosher rules, consuming food when a priest was serving in the sacred task in the temple, to extend that same rule for purity to the social practice of eating food in their homes. That's what the Pharisees did. They adopted the priestly rule for purity in food consumption by priests in the temple to everyone, every Jew, every meal in their own homes. By this practice, the Pharisees emphasized the distinctiveness of their Jewish identity and the differentiation of the Jewish way of life to an unprecedented degree. So the Pharisees aimed to make a way of life known by its separation from Gentile culture, the hallmark of authentic Judaism. The Essenes' origin also occurred in the 2nd century before the Common Era. One of the issues for them was a dispute about the legitimacy of the holder of the office of the high priest. Others involved rules about the observation of the Jewish religious law. The most distinctive of these was that candidates for admission to the Essene community were required to hand over all of their possessions to the community. No private property. If you're going to be a real, shall we say, you're going to embrace the idealism of what Judaism is about. You're going to hand over all of your possessions to the community. This was an unprecedented requirement in the history of Judaism. No other group of Jews prior to the Essenes made this requirement. We have less evidence about the Sadducees, but what we do have indicates that they played a leading role in the priesthood and the temple, and refused to regard any writings other than those of the Pentateuch, the so-called 5 books of Moses, as having any authority for understanding the requirements of Judaism. In other words, all the literature of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible were not authoritative for the Sadducees. They were, shall we say, high-level conservatives. They were strictly the five books of Moses. Jesus and his followers became aware of a new religious movement just getting underway in their lifetime, led by a man named John, who was baptizing people in the Jordan River to symbolize a cleansing from sin. Probably John chose the Jordan River as the location for this ritual to represent the purity of Israel's origins, when by crossing the Jordan, Israel first entered the Promised Land and, according to the biblical story, became a new nation. It appears that John believed that the only way they could prepare for the new age that was about to dawn was through the direct intervention of God, was to embrace the symbolism of Israel's origins by crossing the Jordan into a new life. What's notable about each of these groups, these four groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, followers of John the Baptist, all four of them, they were all concerned with purifying and perfecting their commitment to Jewish religious law. That's what they were trying to do, to become a pure and perfect form of their religious tradition. Jesus was not concerned with the Jewish religious law, but with an unconditional commitment to imitating the behavior of the Father in heaven. You therefore must be perfect. You therefore must be totally consistent. As your Father, you must behave in such a way that everybody will know that you are the sons of your Heavenly Father. That's the model for Jesus. He addressed his appeal to Jews and Gentiles alike, not just to his fellow Jews, as the other four forms that I've described were concerned with. One might say, therefore, it seems to me that Jesus was advocating a form of religious universalism. His Jewish groups, the Jewish groups whose religious ambitions we have characterized previously, were being called to become perfect practitioners of Judaism, whereas Jesus was calling his hearers to a new humanity. To those who became his opponents, Jesus seemed to be saying that Jewish religious law had become irrelevant. But those who became his followers heard in his message an invitation to a new humanity. In the words of one of his most famous followers, quote, "Now before Christ came, we were confined under the law. Before Christ came, we were confined under the law, kept under restraint, so that the law was our custodian until Christ came. But now that Christ has come, we are no longer under a custodian, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." So at this point, with these celebrative words of one of Jesus' most famous followers in the first century, I will pause and ask Bill Anderson to come and moderate the reception of your questions and comments.
Well, that was a tour de force. Let's see if we have questions. We have mics. There's a mic right here. Yeah. Okay. Grant.
Thank you, Roy, so much. That was fascinating. I am conscious of a lot of preceding literature, and I'm wondering whether there's any crossover. I'm thinking of the Greek writers. Thucydides is one of my personal heroes, and there was Aristotle, others. They write very differently from the gospel accounts. very different style and different use of speech entirely. Was there any influence or crossover that you're aware of from that body of material? It doesn't seem as though there's a connection, but I'm wondering.
Grant, I'm not quite catching what the crossover or the connection is. What's the other group? Would you tell me that again?
I'm wondering about whether the classical writers, Thucydides, Herodotus to a lesser extent, Aristotle, others, whether they influence the writing of the Gospels. It seems as though there isn't any connection, and yet I'm puzzled. It seems as though there should be.
Yeah. I think that's a fascinating question, one that is not explicitly dealt with in the sources that we have. We don't have early Christian writers citing those classical authors or those Hellenistic Greek texts. But I'm wondering whether, having grown up at that time with such great, the influence so widespread of Hellenistic culture, whether they may have imbibed some of that. I wonder whether, for example, whether the Apostle Paul, who was probably about the same age as Jesus, was first of all a fierce opponent of this new religious group, as you will recall, and later became a disciple, an advocate, an apostle, was a Pharisee, and was educated in Greek language. Whether that influence shows up in a certain receptivity to what I have called a religious universalism, but that's only a guess that where that may have come from. We don't have specific evidence to answer your question directly.
Roy, you mentioned at the beginning that there were various sources from which we were able to get information about the historic Jesus, and you mentioned the Gospel of Thomas. What did Thomas provide?
The Gospel of Thomas is another instance of a gospel not being a narrative gospel. The Gospel of Thomas does not tell the story of Jesus' life. No birth stories, no account of Jesus' activity as a traveling person, and no mention of his crucifixion, no mention of that. It's a collection of sayings. And the early church regarded that collection as embracing heretical points of view. And so it was not seriously considered for the canon. It was left out of the canon, left out of the New Testament. But in our work in the Jesus Seminar, we decided that about half of the sayings in Thomas made as good a case for being sayings of Jesus as any others. So that's why we included it in the 5 Gospels rather than restricting our attention to Gospels to only 4. Well, John is not one of the synoptic Gospels because it's a very different style of Gospel. I'll just give you a couple of examples to document the difference. I've said that parables in the synoptic Gospels are one of the 2 principal forms of oral transmission of Jesus' sayings, Jesus' teaching, parables. There are lots of them in the synoptic Gospels. There is no parable in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, there are long speeches which are called lengthy discourses. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the good shepherd, and so on. In reference to Nicodemus to be born again. So John has a very different take on the gospel story. And what was I going to say about John? That's it, maybe.
How did the resurrection get into the Gospels? Where did that idea come from?
Well, the resurrection was a claim made by a number of people in the early church who, after the crucifixion of Jesus, I would say, were not prepared to say, well, that's the end of it. That's the end of the story. The story of Jesus has come to a brutal end, and it's over. They thought there was something going on in the teaching of Jesus and in the activity that he recommended that should be preserved, and they believed, given their worldview, that God is the ruler of history, that in the providence of God, God would not let Jesus go either. And the way of maintaining him and keeping his life and influence active in their community was to claim resurrection. Resurrection had been a Jewish idea for 200 years before it became a Christian idea. It was the way the Jewish community, or many of them, not all of them, many of them resorted to as a way of not letting the bad guys win the struggle in good and evil, between good and evil in the world. That even if evil was prevailing now in our present experience, the day would come, God would resurrect the righteous and they would inherit the kingdom. So it's that article of faith, really, you could say, is the way the idea of resurrection had its origin, that it was a way of preserving the power and justice of God.
I've always wondered, about the saying of Jesus, the way to the Father is through me. Isn't that something that's attributed to him? Maybe not.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite catching your question.
Well, it's not a question. I'm asking you, is it not attributed to Jesus, the way to the Father is through me?
I think that's the Gospel of John, isn't it? Yeah. And that's John's claim, that there is something distinctive, something unique that is available to human beings only through Jesus as God's Son. That's a theological claim.
I'm sorry. I've always wondered if that could be interpreted in a mystical sense, if it were translated to the way to the Father is only within me through myself. That's what I wondered, if there's been any talk about that.
I don't know how to respond to that. I'm not into mysticism very much. I'm a realist. I'm a historian, and that's my interest. That's my plane of inquiry and research. So I don't know what to say about that.
I was interested in your discourse. You mentioned Jewish rule or Jewish law, and didn't describe it any further. And I'm just curious how it affected everything, and what its content was.
The content of Jewish law? Well, one simple content that everybody knows are the Ten Commandments. The Jewish people understood themselves to be in a covenant with God. That how can I put this? What God asks of the Jewish people to be his people is to behave in such a way that's consistent with the righteousness of God, shall we say, the God's sense of justice and truth. And that being faithful to a kind of a contract between God and his people was the basis of their religion. That comes down to, one primary version of this is to say that along with Moses, Moses and his generation credited the intervention of God with the ability of the Jewish people to escape from bondage in Egypt, and that initiative on God's part, that generosity on God's part, created a relationship between the people of Israel and the people of God, and if that was to continue, then the Jewish people had to honor the terms of that contract, which are spelled out in the Ten Commandments. Here are the terms of the contract, or the covenant, between God and his people. These are the things you must do to be a part of God's community. And so a lot of the Judaism comes from that and is an extension of that in our attempts, in the case of the prophets, to interpret what that means for their generation in their lifetime.
Can you hear me? There we go. Do you have any information about the non-textual Jesus history, for example, Josephus or Roman texts or anything that is outside of the realm of the biblical texts?
You mean as sources for information about Jesus?
Yes, that were our history outside of the texts.
Josephus, for those of you who may not know, was a first century Jewish historian, a Pharisee, a member of the leading, what shall we say, the upper echelons of Jewish society and culture in the first century. He wrote a lengthy history of the Jewish-Roman War, and he wrote a lengthy history of the people of Israel. He mentions only very briefly that there was this man from, I don't know whether he mentions the place, Nazareth or not, but he does mention the crucifixion of Jesus under Pontius Pilate. But that's the only information he has. People were not interested in an uneducated, informally educated young man from what shall we say, the backwaters of Israel and Galilee, writing anything about him that could possibly be significant. So there are no written texts about Jesus and his movement. No.
You've said you're a realist and a historian. You've given us an admirable demonstration on both counts. Your scholarship is impressive, and I appreciate very much your talk today. It's been a splendid presentation, and thank you so very much.
Grant, you're very generous, Grant. I appreciate that. As much as I respect you, a scholar of your standing and a professional architect of your accomplishment, that means a lot. Thank you.
Are there other questions? Joyce?
Bill, could you reread his biography? It was so impressive, my goodness.
Well, I don't have all the details. He could, but I'm not going to ask him to do it. But he was a professor at Whitman, a named professor, Weyerhaeuser Professor of Religion. He was part of this group of scholars in the 80s that started this intensive examination of the evidence about the life of Jesus. And that group of scholars produced a number of books, of which he is co-author of several, and some scholarly papers published in the top journals in the theology world. And he also received an award from Whitman College for faculty accomplishment. So he was well known there and well regarded there. But I can give you a complete bibliography if you like. As I say, the latest book on Paul was published this spring, 2024. So Roy is still hard at work, and
How
and
about
I think we're all the beneficiaries of that.
How about Harvard? What was he doing?
Well, he got his PhD there, and I don't know what else you want to say
What
about
was
Harvard.
the subject?
No, I'm not a Harvard professor, but I'm the beneficiary of Harvard professors. The time when I was there in the 1960s was a very high water mark for the Harvard Divinity School, the Graduate School of Religion at Harvard. It was just a great time. I had a great experience, a great education, changed my life. And I have, great appreciation for what the scholarship there, and the difference it makes. Yeah.
Any other questions? I think we have one more question, maybe.
When I was in college a century ago, we had a young speaker one time who changed the introduction to the gospel, saying, in the beginning was the word, instead of that, he said, in the beginning was the idea. And that concept sort of has been with me ever since. Particularly in a relational universe, it seems that you can move from that to say that Jesus expresses in human form the essence of a relational universe. I just enjoy that. I like working with what we know best about science.
Thank you. You want to respond to that, or a good comment? Anything else? If not, I can share with Grant's approval that we really have appreciated not only Roy's life work here in generating this information, but sharing it with us today. It's been very helpful. I'm smarter today than I was yesterday, and I think if that's true, there's hope for us all. Thank you very much, Roy.
Thank you.